Hello, everybody. So, let us now do a quick synopsis of environmental issues for NEET crash course. So, in environmental issues, we need to first discuss about how we are misusing the environment, that is, increase in population size that has increased in the demand for food, water, and shelter, and that has led to undesirable changes in our environment, and such undesirable changes in the physical, chemical, or biological characteristics of air, water, or soil is referred to as environmental pollution. And the government of India has passed an act called the Environment Protection Act in 1986. What exactly is a pollutant? So, you all have to remember that any substance that is released in excessive quantities and any substance that can bring about an undesirable change is considered to be a pollutant. Now, to give you some of the examples for pollutant, you have nitrates and phosphates, which are mostly found in fertilizers, which are known to decrease the fertility, increase the fertility to such an extent that obviously it leads to a gradual decline because it will not allow the biodiversity to thrive on such a soil. And pollution is somewhat different from the process of contamination, which is the presence of harmful organisms or their products. So here it is not just harmful organisms or their products, it is mostly certain substances which are present in excess. So remember that a pollutant is anything that brings about an undesirable change is referred to as a pollutant. So causes of air pollution, you all are aware there are two major causes. One is called a gaseous pollutant as well as a particulate pollutant, and then you have natural as well as man-made. Now you can see some of the examples of natural pollutants mentioned over here, and very important to remember is 99.95% of air pollutants are natural, whereas 0.05% are man-made. Now even though man-made pollutants are lesser in number, but I think the air quality is being depleted mostly because of man-made pollutants rather than natural air pollutants. What are some of the sources of air pollution? Some of the sources of air pollution include combustion of fossil fuel, that is what happens when you burn petroleum, coal, natural gas, etc. Now we also burn fossil fuel like petrol and diesel in our automobile. So automobile exhaust is a major source of air pollution. And then we have industries and mining industries as well, and like mentioned over here, automobiles are the chief source of air pollution. They contribute to 75% of noise pollution and 60 to 80%. So you can imagine the contribution. About 60 to 80% of air pollution is because of automobiles. Chemical industries also can contribute towards air pollution. Those industries which make pesticides, which make fertilizers, cosmetics, and then you have processing industries like cotton and textiles usually let out fine dust particles into the air. Asbestos industry, welding industry, stone crushing and gem grinding industry, and mining industry, they are all known to emit a lot of toxins into the air, such as oxides, poisonous oxides of carbon, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, etc., and also release a lot of particulate matter into the air, and chemicals such as hydrocarbons, fluorides, photochemical oxidants, and CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons. So here are some of the examples of the chemical industries and what kind of toxins they liberate into the air. Air pollutants, how do they affect living organisms? They cause injury to living organisms, they reduce the growth and yield of plants and crops, and they cause premature death in the case of plants. How do they mostly affect humans and animals? In humans and animals, they are known to affect the respiratory system. They cause harmful effects like inflammation of the bronchial tubes, and that may lead to premature death, and that may lead to certain severe conditions such as asthma and bronchitis, isn't it? So, majorly in case of humans and animals, our respiratory system is severely affected by air pollution. There are two types of air pollutants. Primary air pollutants. Now primary air pollutants are pollutants as they are not reacting with anything else, or they are not products of some kind of a reaction. Like for example, you have carbon monoxide, unburnt hydrocarbons, etc. Whereas if primary air pollutants react with each other, so when they are suspended in the air, when they are present in the air for a long period of time, the primary air pollutants end up reacting with each other, and they give rise to an even more toxic form of of pollutant, which is referred to as a secondary air pollutant. So secondary air pollutants are products of reaction between primary air pollutants. You have peroxyacetyl nitrate, that is PAN, ozone, nitric acid, sulfuric acid. Smog is a very important pollutant, which is a secondary air pollutant, which is a reaction that is happening between so many primary pollutants in the presence of sunlight, and we call it as a photochemical smog. Automobile pollution, like we saw, it contributes to 60 to 80% of air pollution and 75% of noise pollution. Mostly the chemicals released by automobiles include unburnt hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, sulfur oxides, ammonia, and most poisonous lead. That's why it is important to use unleaded petrol, because lead is something which is very toxic to living organisms, and one of the major sources of lead is automobile pollution. How do we control automobile pollution? Now, by installing certain structures or certain components to our vehicles, which are referred to as catalytic converters. These catalytic converters contain in them certain expensive metals like platinum, palladium, and rhodium. What they do is they convert some poisonous gases into less poisonous forms. For example, they convert unburnt hydrocarbons into carbon dioxide and water, and they also convert toxic oxides of carbon like carbon monoxide and nitric oxide into less toxic forms, that is carbon dioxide and nitrogen. It is very important to note that if you are using a catalytic converter in your vehicle, you must ensure that you must use unleaded petrol, because lead inactivates these catalysts, which are platinum, palladium, and rhodium, and if these catalysts are inactivated, then the purpose is not served. As a result, if you have installed a catalytic converter, you have to make sure that your vehicle is running on unleaded petrol. And then proper maintenance of automobiles, of course, regular phasing out of old vehicles, and you have to maintain the automobile regularly. You have to get the engine checked so that the efficiency is good and it is burning the fuel to its full possible efficiency. Moving on to noise pollution. When we talk about noise pollution, initially it was not recognized as air pollution, but later it has been recognized as an integral part of air pollution, because it leads to several psychological and physiological distress in case of human beings. Even if you get a brief exposure to high level noise, that is 150 decibel or more, then you can see that is something that is generated by takeoff of a jet plane or a rocket. It can lead to permanent hearing loss in case of humans. In India, like I said, initially the Air Act was enforced in 1981, but then later it included even noise as well. So it was amended in the year 1987 to include noise as an integral component of air pollution. So noise is also considered as an air pollutant today. In order to get rid of the particulate matter, we have to discuss about something called electrostatic precipitator. So all of you please remember, electrostatic precipitator gets rid of particulate matter, and this electrostatic precipitator is a device which has electrode wires which are maintained at very high voltage, and they release a corona of electrons, and then when you pass a dusty air or dirty air through this particular instrument, the dust particles in the dirty air will get attached to electrons, and these electrons will impart a negative charge to the dust particles. And then what happens is you will pass these dust particles through a set of collecting plates which are grounded, and these negatively charged dust particles, how did the dust particles get negatively charged? Because these electrons attach to the dust particles, and these dust particles which are negatively charged will get collected on the collecting plates which are grounded. It is said that these electrostatic precipitators can remove particles of 0.05 to 5 micron meter in size, very small size, and they can remove them to the extent of 99%, but it is very important that the dirty air that is passed through the electrostatic precipitator must be passed very slowly, so that these particles can react with the electrode wires, they can get imparted with a negative charge, and then they can settle down easily on the collecting dust, on the collecting plates. Okay, so here you can see the image of an electrostatic precipitator. You are letting in the dirty air through here, and the clean air is coming out of the other end, and notice that there is a discharge corona of electrons around the negatively charged wires. The dust particles will get negatively charged, and then as they are passed through the collecting plates, you can see how the dust particles will settle down on the collecting plates, and the air that is coming out of the other end is relatively pure. And then you have another equipment, another instrument here, another apparatus which is called as a scrubber. As you can see, a scrubber is mostly used in order to get rid of oxides of sulfur in the air, not particulate matter. It is mostly used to get rid of toxic gases. As you can see, dirty air is passed into the scrubber, and spray of water or lime is let into this particular scrubber. So this dirty air is treated with a spray of water and lime. Then what happens is this water and lime will react with the toxic gases like oxides of sulfur that is present in the dirty air, and these oxides of sulfur are precipitated, they're removed from the air, and so the air that is coming out of the scrubber is relatively cleaner. So remember that scrubber is mostly used to get rid of oxides of sulfur by passing a spray of water or lime through the dirty air. Now we were talking about electrostatic precipitator which can get rid of particulate matter. Now according to the Central Pollution Control Board, particles which have a diameter of less than 2.5 micron meter or 2.5 micron meter, which are called PM 2.5, are the most toxic or most harmful to the human health, because these are very, very tiny particles and they can easily make their way into your airways, into your respiratory tract, and they can cause breathing and respiratory distress, irritation and inflammation and damage to the lungs as well as your alveoli, leading to premature death. So basically, how do we control? Because we saw that automobile pollution is the automobile exhaust is the one that is a major contributor to air pollution. So switching over to public transport, phasing out of old vehicles, use of lead-free petrol, which is called green gold or green petrol, and use of petrol with reduced sulfur in it are some of the measures that one can adopt to reduce automobile pollution, especially in urban regions. Now, the best example for controlling vehicular pollution comes from a case study in Delhi, where in 1990, Delhi was ranked 4th among the 41 most polluted cities in the world, and therefore a public interest litigation was filed in the Supreme Court by the citizens of Delhi, and immediately the Supreme Court took an order, and it sent an order to the government that within a short period of time they have to take strict measures in order to overcome or reduce the extent of air pollution. The entire fleet of public transport, that is buses, was shifted from diesel to compressed natural gas, and all buses in Delhi were converted to run on compressed natural gas by the end of 2002. Why we are using compressed natural gas over here? Because it is much better than diesel. It burns efficiently, it is more economical, it is very cheap, it cannot be siphoned off by thieves or adulterated like how thieves can siphon off petrol from your vehicles. It cannot be done like that. It cannot be adulterated. But the only problem with compressed natural gas is laying down of pipelines to distribute or deliver the compressed natural gas, like how we have petrol bunks to deliver petrol and diesel. Development of such or setting up such bunks or such points or such pumps in order to distribute the compressed natural gas is one of the bigger challenges. So some of the other measures that were taken by Delhi was phasing out of old vehicles, use of unleaded petrol, low sulfur petrol, and like we have already discussed, use of catalytic converters with platinum, palladium and rhodium, and stringent pollution level norms for vehicles were undertaken. Now, after air pollution, we move on to water pollution. Of course, change in the physical, chemical, and biological quality or deterioration of the physical, chemical, biological quality of water is referred to as water pollution. It may be natural or man-made. The government of India has passed the Water Act, the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, way back in 1974 to safeguard and protect all our water resources against pollution. Natural water pollution is something that is brought forth by clay and silt and animal waste and dead and fallen leaves like twigs and fruits and leaves, etc., which fall on the forest floor. So this is something which is brought about by natural phenomena, and that's why it is called natural water pollution. Something which is brought forth by man-made activities or human activities is called as anthropogenic or man-made water pollution. Majorly it is because of domestic sewage, it is because of using soaps and detergents and agricultural fields, because of excessive fertilizers and pesticides, industrial waste, heat, radioactive waste from radioactive research centers as well as nuclear power reactors, and animal waste from sheds and slaughterhouses, and of course oil spills. All of them contribute towards water pollution. So we can classify some of the water pollutants like municipal waste that include sewage and detergents, and industrial waste are mostly municipal wastes are basically biodegradable for that matter if it is properly treated, if it is not just dumped straight away into the water body. Like for example, you know that sewage can be treated, so most of it is biodegradable, and it is therefore a boon that it can be biodegraded, it can be treated and then let into the natural water bodies or reservoirs. Industrial wastewater, like we had discussed, is mostly from thermal pollution, which include from thermal power stations. You get a lot of hot water, and then these industrial wastes also contain a lot of organic and inorganic residues in them. And then we have surface runoff, like for example, if you've sprayed a lot of pesticides and insecticides, and if you used a lot of fertilizers in your agricultural land, whenever there is rainfall, whenever there is a storm, a thunderstorm, the water carries out or carries away all these pesticides and fertilizers into the nearest water bodies, isn't it? So storm water from urban and industrial site contains a lot of biodegradable waste, as well as it contains a lot of toxins like metals, acids and other chemicals. And then of course in seas we have these we have these oil tankers which carry a lot of oil, and accidentally if there's a wreckage, then it can lead to spilling of all these oils into the surrounding water, and that can put the aquatic ecosystem in grave danger. So domestic sewage, the only way to treat domestic sewage, as you all know, is basically the sewage treatment. And what is this domestic sewage made up of? It mostly consists of human excreta, kitchen refuse or food residue, as well as detergents. It accounts for very important, like how automobile exhaust accounted for a major chunk of air pollution. Here domestic sewage accounts for a major chunk of water pollution. 75% of water pollution is because of domestic sewage. Domestic sewage, like we said, it contains biodegradable organic matter, which is actually a blessing because it can be treated, it can be degraded by microorganisms. And you know, you have learnt about sewage treatment in Microbes in Human Welfare, how our main goal while we are treating sewage is to bring down the biochemical oxygen demand. We had discussed that if the biochemical oxygen demand of a water sample is lower and lower, that means it is less polluted. So when we are treating the domestic sewage or municipal waste, our main concern is to bring down the biochemical oxygen demand, subjected by tertiary treatment with certain biosafe chemicals, and then letting it out into the nearby water resources so that nature can take care of it, nature can carry out further actions of repair. So basically, if you see that sewage is being dumped into the river body, say for example, you can see that there is a drastic decline in dissolved oxygen in the water that is at the point where it is dumped, and there is a decline in population of fishes and other organisms. Say for example, you have rivers like Ganga and Kaveri into which industrial wastes are being dumped. The point where these toxic gases are dumped, a little below those points, a little downstream, because the water is heavily mixed with these pollutants, there is a drastic decline of oxygen, due to which several populations of species which are found in the aquatic ecosystems, their numbers start dwindling, and it also leads to enrichment of water with excessive nutrients, and this leads to algal blooms and eutrophication, growth of excessive plants in the water bodies. This mostly happens in stagnant water bodies, not in rivers. However, in rivers, as the river keeps flowing, the waste gets diluted, and if you move further downstream, then obviously the oxygen levels will increase. But immediately downstream to the point where the sewage or the waste material is being dumped into the river, you can see a drastic decline in dissolved oxygen and a rapid increase in biochemical oxygen demand. So like we saw, if you talk about, now we are not talking about river, actually we are talking about standing water bodies. There is something which we see called eutrophication. Now suppose there is agricultural runoff from the nearby agricultural fields, where there was a rainfall or there was a thunderstorm, or there was a flood which has carried a lot of these agricultural wastes into the nearby water body. And if you used a fertilizer rich in nitrates and phosphates, what would happen to the water body? It would get nutriently enriched, and it would lead to a sudden outburst of planktonic growth, which is called algal bloom. And this algal bloom will make the water toxic to humans. It will also change the color of water. It will also impart a characteristic odor to water, and this water is not potable. It cannot be consumed by humans because this algal enriched water can be toxic. And then gradually what will happen is these plants like water hyacinth or Eichhornia crassipes, which is famously called the terror of Bengal, which was actually introduced into India owing to its mauve colored flowers, thinking of its ornamental value, but today it has overridden the local population of plants. It forms a thick blanket on the water surface in such water that is enriched with nutrients which are called eutrophic water systems, and as a result it causes severe imbalance in the ecosystem dynamics. And you can imagine if a thick blanket of this plant is formed on the water body, it will cut off the oxygen supply, sunlight supply to the deeper parts of the water, and all the aquatic ecosystems like fishes and other animals will die out, and literally the lake will be choked to death. This is called accelerated eutrophication because this is ultimately a product of human activity. So then we have also to take into account the sewage from home and mostly from hospital waste, which may contain certain toxic pathogenic bacteria which cause cholera, dysentery, and viruses which can cause jaundice, and therefore it can have the danger of spreading certain diseases among human population. And wastewater from industries will contain heavy metals like mercury, copper, and cadmium, which can enter the food chain and severely harm human health. And then I told you from thermal power stations you have heated water, superheated water, which is directly let into water bodies, and then you can imagine there will be a sudden shift in the temperature dynamics of the water bodies, and that will kill all the temperature sensitive organisms. And this is something which is brought forth by superheated water. It is called thermal pollution, another danger of water pollution in aquatic ecosystems. We were discussing about heavy metals, and we saw how sometimes heavy metals make their way, or toxic substances which may include heavy metals may make their way into the food chain, and they may drastically increase in their concentration as we go up the trophic level. This is called as biomagnification. Why do they increase in their concentration as we go up the trophic level? Because they are neither metabolized nor are they excreted. They keep accumulating in the body, mostly in the fatty tissue or the adipose tissue of the organisms, and they keep increasing from one trophic level to another. The best example for biomagnification is this picture given in your NCERT textbook, which is the biomagnification of DDT up the food chain. Notice how the level of DDT in water is as low as 0.003 part per billion. ppb is parts per billion, which is a very very minute concentration, but by the time it passes through the food chain and it reaches to the top carnivore, that is eagle, say for example a falcon or an eagle that is feeding on a fish, you can see how the DDT level has increased, has been blown up to a concentration of 25 parts per million. This drastic increase in the toxicant or a pollutant up the food chain is referred to as biomagnification. The case study of integrated water treatment comes from a small town called town of Arcata, where people came together in California. It is a town in California, and where people came together, the townspeople collaborated with the scientists of Humboldt State University. They connected a set of marshes, about 60 hectares of marshes, and they carried out purification or treatment of the wastewater. First, they carried out conventional sedimentation, filtered out the wastewater, treated it with chlorine to remove some of the dangerous chemicals, and then after that to remove the particulate chemicals or particulate matter. After this, what they did was they set up a series of 6 connected marshes. Marshland is basically land which is found at the edges of a water body, an inland water body like a lake or a backwater, etc. They connected 60 hectares of these, and they allowed this land, they seeded this land with lot of plants and algae and fungi and bacteria. They allowed the treated water, which was treated by conventional methods, to pass gradually through these 60 hectares of marshland, and these living organisms like algae, fungi, bacteria, and plants assimilated the waste products, the pollutants, and therefore the water was treated or purified naturally. The water coming out of the marsh at the other end was relatively pure. Not only that, the marsh also was home, or it became a sanctuary. There was a high level of biodiversity. There were a lot of species of migratory birds and animals and plants which started living in the marshes. So it both became a wastewater treatment, a natural wastewater treatment plant, as well as it became a biodiversity hotspot. Another thing about to prevent the dumping of sewage into the nearby water bodies is ecological sanitation, which is use of dry composting toilets where it is practical, hygienic, cost efficient, cost effective, and efficient, where human excreta is converted into a resource. Such eco sanitations or eco sand toilets are still functional today, are actually functional in states of Kerala and in countries like Sri Lanka. Now, coming on to solid waste, another problem with solid waste is we are mostly talking about municipal solid waste. Municipal solid waste from homes, offices, stores, schools, and hospitals basically includes waste such as paper, food waste, plastic, glass, metal, rubber, leather, textile, etc. The biggest problem is dumping them. Initially, the solution was putting them in open dumps or by burying them by digging up pits, which is called as sanitary landfills. But now, how much of the earth will you bury? How much of the earth will you cover with waste, or how much of the earth will you dig up and bury waste in it? There is a limit to it. So sanitary landfill is not an idea, because here the waste just sits over there, it doesn't get decomposed, isn't it? So the biggest solution is to segregate the waste into biodegradable, recyclable, and the non-biodegradable. By doing so, at least we can reduce the burden of the generation of solid waste by our community. Hospitals also generate a lot of solid waste. The only solution is, because the hospital waste contain a lot of toxins or pathogens in them, the only solution is to burn them down completely by using incinerators. Case study for plastic waste is in our own city in Bangalore, like how a plastic sack manufacturer Ahmed Khan, how he realized that he could also make something useful out of plastic waste, and therefore he created a finely powdered recycled plastic which was called as Poly Blend, and in cooperation or collaboration with one of our engineering colleges in our country and our Bangalore city cooperation, they came up with an idea where they mixed this finely powdered recycled plastic, which is poly blend, with bitumen, that is something that is used to lay down roads, and they saw that this mixture, when it was used in laying down roads or um, in using it to lay down roads, as you see in the case of asphalt or tar, they saw that the road's quality, the durability of the road, especially the bitumen's water repellent property, was enhanced, and it also increased the road life by a factor of 3. So rather than just laying down asphalt which contains bitumen in it, by mixing that bitumen with this finely powdered recycled plastic which is referred to as polyblend, they saw that they could enhance the life of the road by a factor of 3. So this is how you can turn something which is wasteful into something that is useful, which is an excellent case study in our own city by Ahmed Khan, who was a plastic sack manufacturer. Remember, it all came about by the preparation of this finely powdered recycled plastic that is called polyblend. What about electronic waste, which is irreparable computers and electronic goods? Usually, sadly, what happens is over half of the electronic waste from entire world, it makes its way to developing countries like China, India, and Pakistan. And we have to get rid of them, and we are exposed to certain toxic metals like copper, iron, silica, nickel, gold, etc. The problem is we are putting our people to risk, because in most of our countries there is manual participation of people in getting rid of these e-waste, because they manually dismantle these electronic goods, and thereby they are exposing themselves to harmful toxic fumes, metallic fumes, and toxic metals, etc. And therefore the only solution obviously is to make it more and more machinized, to create certain machines which are capable of dismantling these goods and segregating the components of these goods. And most importantly, the only solution to discarding or to overcoming the problem of electronic waste is recycling the electronic wastes. Then we have soil pollution, which may be removal or addition of nutrients, and basically those substances which cause a reduction in soil productivity, which severely harm the biological, chemical, the physical characteristics of the soil. They are called as soil pollutants. We have agrochemicals, which are soil pollutants. Sometimes excessive manure can also alter the chemical and the biological properties of the soil, making it unfit for plant growth. And then there are industrial effluents which are dumped onto the soil. We saw how solid wastes are literally buried in pits in the ground, and that can obviously pollute the soil in the nearer vicinity. And then you have hospital waste, which contains toxic chemicals and pathogens which can pollute the soil. We have electronic waste. Mostly in the wake of green revolution, we have seen how there is increase of use of agrochemicals, because there has been an increase in crop production, and that is because of the use of agrochemicals, which has contributed significantly towards soil pollution. Basically, the pesticides which we use to kill pests and insects, and fungicides and algicides, and to kill rodents and weeds, all these make their way into the soil ecosystem. They harm the soil ecosystem. They irreparably or irreversibly damage the properties of soil. And then, of course, the use of chemical fertilizers, which are rich in nitrates and phosphates. Sometimes these pesticides and fertilizers and excessive minerals can get carried away by percolating water deep down into the soil and pollute the groundwater aquifers or underground water table. And this is how they get leached down by the percolating rainwater or the water that is used for irrigation practices. Control of soil pollution, of course, safe land use, planning of urbanization, and proper disposal or and management of solid waste, disposal of night soil or human feces and dung in a proper scientific manner, and use of these substances as raw material for biogas production, where it can be channelized towards synthesizing or preparing natural gas or biogas using, say, the biogas plants. And then use of incinerators, like we saw for hospital waste, they need to be completely burnt down. And recycling is for everything. Recycling is the only solution. There is something called organic farming, where you don't use any synthetic fertilizers or synthetic pesticides or insecticides. It is a cyclical zero waste procedure, where the waste product that you get from one process is cycled in as nutrients or raw material for another process. This was basically widely propagated by a farmer in Sonipat, Haryana, called Ramesh Chandra. And today there are many farmers in his Haryana Kisan Club, which all of them propagate organic farming, and they have drastically reduced the extent of soil pollution. So in organic farming, everything is carried under one roof, like beekeeping, dairy farm management, and manure or composting, agriculture, water management. There is absolutely no use of chemical fertilizers, because anyway you're using the cattle dung which is obtained from dairy farm management. And then you're using crop waste also. All the waste that is obtained on the agricultural field after you harvest a crop is used to create compost. And like I said, cattle dung is used to create natural gas, and whatever slurry, the spent slurry left behind after biogas manufacturing, is used as the compost or the manure that is used to add fertility to the soil. And then several other agricultural practices are followed, like crop rotation, to make sure that the soil remains fertile. There is absolutely no use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. This is called organic farming. Then, of course, we have radioactive waste from radioactive research stations and nuclear plants, and these are known to be very poisonous, toxic to living organisms, because they can directly affect our genetic material. They can cause or induce mutations in us, and these have a very long life, and that is why even if we discard them, we are not free of its influence. One of the best ways to discard them, as per the guidelines, is to put them in shielded containers so that the radiations do not leak out, and to bury them at the depth of about 500 meters. But still we are not sure that we have completely gotten rid of them, because who knows, because of some tectonic activity, what if these containers get cracked open, and what if these rays get leaked into the surrounding environment, and that can harm the surrounding ecosystems. Ultimately it can harm the human life also on this planet, isn't it? So therefore, and also people who are actively involved in handling and transporting these radioactive substances need to use certain protective shields, because like we saw, they are very very potent mutation inducing agents or mutagens, these radioactive wastes. Moving on to greenhouse effect and global warming, we have lot of gases in our atmosphere like carbon dioxide, chlorofluorocarbon, nitrous oxide, methane, water vapor, ozone. All these gases are known to trap the long wave heat radiations which are emitted by the Earth's surface at the end of the day. Throughout the day, our Earth's surface is receiving sunlight from sunlight, and it is absorbing all the heat, and of course it gives away that heat later, and this heat is trapped by these gases and it is re-radiated back to the Earth's surface, and that causes the warming of the Earth's surface. This phenomenon is called the greenhouse effect, and the warming of the Earth that is brought out by the greenhouse effect is called the global warming. So basically, why is because light is emitted, light is allowed to escape into the outer atmosphere, but heat waves, the long wavelength radiations, IR radiations, are trapped by these gases. Not only do they trap them, but they reflect them back to the Earth's surface. The Earth's surface again takes up the heat and therefore it becomes warm. This is called as global warming. So for greenhouse effect, like we saw, there are greenhouse gases which are in our atmosphere which are not allowing the heat to escape. They are constantly trapping the heat and re-radiating the heat back to the Earth's surface. Some of the greenhouse gases, the major contributor is carbon dioxide. This is very important from the competitive point of view. Major contributing greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, 60% contribution to greenhouse effect, 20% methane, 14% chlorofluorocarbon, and 6% is nitrous oxide. We also have water vapor, and which also may contribute towards the greenhouse effect. Okay. So remember the relative percentages. It is very very important. Because of greenhouse effect, we can see global warming like I told you, and just over the last 3 decades there has been an increase of 0.6 degree. According to this, there are also certain odd climatic changes that happen because of greenhouse effect and global warming called El Nino effect. There is more melting of polar ice caps. If the overall global temperature increases, the polar ice caps will melt, there will be sea level rise, and all the coastal areas will get submerged, and there will be odd climatic changes like I just mentioned, the El Nino effect. Like you see some of the changes over the years, methane, which had a concentration in our atmosphere as 700 parts per billion in the pre-industrial time, has now reached 1750 parts per billion in the year 2000, which is a very very high concentration. Chlorofluorocarbon is basically released by certain aerosols and propellants like you have the jet planes, and like in the case of jet fuel, you can see these aerosols. Even air conditioners and refrigerators can release chlorofluorocarbons into our atmosphere. Nitrous oxide, how in the pre-industrial times the concentration was only 270 parts per billion, but now it has reached 316 parts per billion. The major sources of nitrous oxide is combustion of nitrogen rich fuels, livestock waste like in the case of animal sheds, and organic farms, and breakdown of nitrogen fertilizers drastically, which is used in the soil to enhance the soil fertility. So indirectly you can see how agricultural farms are also contributing towards greenhouse effect. Effect on atmosphere, we already saw that it can lead to cooling of the stratosphere, and it can ultimately, because if there is a heating of the troposphere, it can ultimately lead to the cooling of the upper regions of the stratosphere, which has had a drastic impact on the ozone hole. It has disrupted communication also because of cooling in the thermosphere, which is important for radio communication. Some of the approaches to deal with global warming is, of course, complete replacement of chlorofluorocarbon. We have to get rid of these chemicals called chlorofluorocarbon. We have to increase the vegetation cover. We have to reduce the use of nitrogen fertilizers. Limiting the use of fossil fuels, automobile exhaust, that is burning of automobile exhaust, the number of automobiles that are employed, that are on the streets must be reduced, and use of fluorescent bulbs and filament bulbs in houses also do contribute towards greenhouse effect, and this also needs to be reduced. And then we saw how there is depletion of ozone layer. Ultimately, ozone layer occurs at a height of about 15 to 35 kilometers from the Earth's surface. It is very, very thin over the equator. It occurs at a greater height above the equator. However, it is thicker at the poles, isn't it? And then the thickness of the ozone layer is measured in a unit which is referred to as the Dobson's unit. One of the major ozone depleting substances is chlorofluorocarbon, because chlorofluorocarbon is discharging, or it reacts with the UV radiation in order to release the chlorine atoms, and the chlorine atoms will attack the ozone or the O3 molecule in order to release oxygen, and thus disrupting ozone layer. Although it is occurring in the stratospheric region, this ozone layer has developed a hole in the Antarctic region, probably because all the toxins or all these ozone depleting gases are carried to the polar areas, and that is where they create a hole. Hole is basically not literally a hole, but an area where the ozone layer has become thinner. One of the dangers of depletion of ozone layer is the shorter wave, the intermediate wave of UV. There is shorter UVC, intermediate UVB, and longer UVA. The most detrimental of them is the intermediate wavelength of UVB, and these UVB radiations can reach the Earth's atmosphere and they cause severe damage. See, basically these UVB radiations are shielded by the ozone layer, but because of the thinning of the ozone layer, these UVB radiations reach the Earth's atmosphere. They cause severe damage to DNA. They are mutagens. They lead to inflammation of cornea, causing snow blindness. They also affect our skin. They cause skin cancer. They cause rapid multiplication of the skin cells by altering the DNA or the genetic material of the skin cells, leading to skin cancer. They can also lead to cataract, as well as, like I said, inflammation of the cornea, leading to temporary blindness, which is called snow blindness. These are the harmful effects of UVB, which is otherwise thankfully shielded by the ozone layer. In order to curb the ozone depletion or the release of these ozone depleting substances, an international treaty called Montreal Protocol was signed in Montreal in 1987, and this Montreal in Canada, and in view of the deleterious effects of ozone layer damage. And what were the guidelines that were laid down? The guidelines have been laid down, and definite roadmaps which every country has to follow to bring out, or you can say to put out, less of these ozone depleting substances into our atmosphere. Sometimes we don't use our natural resources properly, and that also, if there is unplanned, if there is erratic use or unscientific use of our natural resources, it can put our natural resources to risk, and it can lead to its degradation, and this is called improper resource utilization and maintenance. So one of the examples, or one of the detrimental effects, is soil erosion. When you don't use your land properly, or when you convert a forest land into an agricultural land, and when you don't scientifically carry out agriculture in that, you can be resulting in, or you can be creating a removal or carrying out a removal of the fertile topsoil layer, and this is called soil erosion. What can cause soil erosion? Over cultivation, unscientific agriculture, unrestricted grazing. Animals are left to graze at their own will, they are not restricted at all, and then forests are cut down, deforestation, proper irrigation practices are not carried out in the soil. All this will reduce the quality of the soil and leading to soil erosion. Converting fertile land into large uncultivable barren land is called as desertification. Of course, the major cause of desertification, where patches of forests are converted into barren land, is because of increased urbanization. Then you know about deforestation, removal or decrease or deterioration of forest cover. Actually, it has been observed, it has been reported, 40% of the forests have been lost in the tropics today. 1% of the forests have been lost in the temperate regions. In India, the forest cover was 30%. Sadly, now it is only 19%. According to the National Forest Policy, what does it recommend? Under normal, ideal conditions, it recommends 33% of forest forest cover for the plains and 67% forest cover for the hills. But see how there has been a reduction in our own country from 30% in the past to 19% today, and in tropical regions the reduction is 40%. In temperate regions the reduction of forest cover is 1%. This removal or decrease or deterioration or cutting down of trees is referred to as deforestation. Causes of deforestation is why? Because man would want to convert forest into agricultural land for his own selfishness, like we saw how great stretches or vast stretches of forest in the Amazonian rainforest is being converted to agricultural land. You know why? To grow grasses and soya bean to feed beef cattle. So for man's selfish needs, you are converting forest land into agriculture, which is one of the major causes of deforestation. There was another ancient practice of agriculture which is even today followed in certain northeastern states called Jhum cultivation, where people used to occupy a patch of forest, cut down the trees over there, burn the trees and use the ash as a fertilizer and till that particular land and carry out agriculture there and cattle grazing and farming over there. After that, they would move to a new piece of land. They would leave behind that area for natural recovery. But today, because the population and our demand for food is so much, there is so many mouths to feed, there is no recovery phase. And how many forests can you occupy like that? You go to a forest area, you burn it down, you convert it into a farming land, you use it, you reap its benefits, you leave it behind, you go to another forest. So if everybody does that, there will be no forest cover left on our planet. So some of these ancient practices like slash and burn agriculture or Jhum cultivation today has led to a lot of deforestation. Prevention is afforestation, where there was no plants before, you have started planting trees over there, or where a forest was existing before and it was brought down for some reason and again you have regrown that forest. Something which you regrow is called as reforestation, and somewhere where you plant trees where plants never existed before, that is called as afforestation. So afforestation is where you grow a forest where none existed earlier. Reforestation is where you restore the vegetation in an area where once there was a forest that was thriving and it was removed due to some man-made activity, or it was due to some natural calamity, or maybe a forest fire, or maybe a volcanic eruption, or anything, or destruction due to an earthquake or anything of that sort. So somewhere where you plant trees where none existed before, that is called afforestation, and where you plant or restore the vegetation in a place where vegetation was destroyed for some reason but it did exist in the past, it is called reforestation. The best example for reforestation, or how plants are important or vegetation is important, and how some people in the past have shown exemplary courage in protecting our wildlife, comes from the case study of people's participation in conservation of forests or conserving trees. In 1731, in the early 18th century, a king of Jodhpur sent across some of his workers to, or ministers and workers, to bring for wood from the forest in the nearby village which was inhabited by Bishnois. And these Bishnoi communities, they are known to exist peacefully with nature and they are known to worship their trees. So they did not allow these kingsmen to collect wood from their village. Mostly they grow a type of a plant which grows in their village, is called the Kejarli. This village was called the Kejarli village because it has lot of these plants called the Prosopis, which is the Kejri tree in this particular village. So when they went to collect wood or collect the material from this plant, they were not allowed by these people. The Bishnoi community thwarted them or stopped them, but they did not stop. And especially a woman called Amrita Devi from this Bishnoi community, she put up a fight with these kingsmen, but unfortunately the kingsmen did not heed and they killed this woman and they cut down the trees. And this woman, because she showed exemplary courage in protecting the trees of her community, of her village, the Kejri trees of her village, today the government has instituted an award in her name called the Amrita Devi Bishnoi Wildlife Protection Award, because she came forward and she stood for her community, she stood for her trees. She said that she would not allow the king's men to destroy the trees, to cut down the trees for their selfish reasons, and as a result, she has been one of those people who has shown courage towards protecting what we can consider forests also as wildlife, protecting the wildlife, and therefore an award has been instituted in her name, and the award is called Amrita Devi Bishnoi Wildlife Protection Award. Whoever shows such exemplary courage today is awarded with this particular title, and this is in fond memory of Amrita Devi, who belonged to the Bishnoi community. So this is one case study that you should know in people's participation in conservation of forests. Then we have Chipko movement in Garhwal Himalayas, the tree hugging movement in 1974, where people started hugging the trees and they came in the way of the acts of the contractors. By hugging the trees, they did not allow these contractors bearing their axes in order to cut down the trees. So they protected the trees from being felled, from being cut down, and this is called the Chipko movement, as they were hugging the trees in an attempt to protect them from the acts of the contractors. Today there is a joint forest management. It was instituted by the government way back in 1980s, where you take the help of all the tribal people and all the local communities. It is like a give and take. It is like you can say both of them are benefited. The government is also benefited, the local communities are also benefited. So what is this give and take kind of an arrangement, where the local communities are actively involved in protecting and managing forests? In return, what do the local communities get? Of course, they're taking care of their own home because they live in the forests. That is one thing. And the government also gives them certain forest products. They are allowed to reap the benefits of certain forest products like fruits, gum, rubber, and medicine. So they do their bit to the forest, and the forest also produces certain substances, and they can reap the benefits of these substances, isn't it? So they are also benefited, and they are working hard towards maintaining the forests, and we are also benefited because our country's green cover is protected, and this, which is conducted as a joint effort between the government agencies, between the wildlife protection agencies and the local communities or the tribal people who are living in the wild communities, who are actually living in the forests, isn't it? They live in the cradle of the forests. So this is called the joint forest management. So by doing so, what can be done? Forest can be conserved in a sustainable manner. There is no overuse. Of course, today what is happening is the forest is giving its benefits, but we are overusing it. But when this is done, the local communities take care of the forest, and they make sure that everything is happening in a controlled, in a sustainable manner. There is no overuse. So it basically puts greed in a back seat. It only takes necessity into account in this particular case. So with this, we conclude the synopsis of the chapter Environmental Issues. Thank you.